Welcome to the 21st video on ancient Greece and part 5 of the Peloponnesian War. So let's take a look at the situation report. Now, most of the Athenian Empire at this point was off limits to the Spartans. And the Athenians still held those 292 hostages in Athens. And Pylos and Kythera continued to be an ongoing problem for the Spartans. Now, the Spartans had to launch some sort of counterattack to stop the Athenian aggression. But where could they go? Anything that was accessible by sea was pretty much off limits to the Spartan navy because the Athenians had turned the eastern Mediterranean into their own private lake by this point, and they really couldn't attack Athens and Attica because they knew the first thing the Athenians would do is execute those 292 Spartan hostages. And so they looked towards northern Greece, and the guy they picked was Brasidas. And the reason they picked Brasidas was because the Spartan king was considered weak at this point, and the other Spartan king was considered too young. And Brasidas himself was a very competent officer. He had been involved in some of the action at Pylos, and you will remember he helped save Megara when the Athenians were trying to take that city by treachery. And so he really was the right man for the job. And also this would be a very, very dangerous mission, which we'll get to in a minute, because the Spartans essentially had to go all the way up into northern Greece, and once they got up there, it would be very difficult to resupply the army that was up north. And so there was the realistic possibility that Brasidas might die, so they didn't want to send their king on such a dangerous mission. Now, the main target in northern Greece was a city called Amphipolis, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. Amphipolis was a very, very strategic city for the Athenians, especially up north because it controlled a key trade route. And so the Spartan strategy was essentially to hit the Athenians in the wallet book. And if they started rebellions and took over some of the Athenian strongholds up north, it would strike at the heart of the Athenian economy. Now, Brasidas initially was going to set out with 1,000 mercenaries, and these were essentially hoplites, and 700 helots. And these helots were promised freedom for their service. And the plan was also to pick up more troops on the way up to northern Greece. Okay, let's take a look at a map here so that you get an idea of the route Brasidas had to take. Now, he started out around Corinth, and because Boeotia and Megara were still part of the Peloponnesian League, he was able to go through there pretty easily. Where it got dangerous was through Thessaly. Now, Thessaly was allied to the Athenian Empire, and it pretty much was the widest open plain. So what do plains mean? That means it's easier to raise horses. So the best horsemen were in Thessaly, and that was one of the dangers that Brasidas faced. But he was able to sneak through there and enter into southern Macedonia. Now, Macedonia had been an on and off ally of Athens, but the Macedonian king Perdiccas promised to switch sides if Brasidas made it up north. But Brasidas soon learned to distrust Perdiccas. He quickly figured out that the Macedonians only wanted to use the Spartans as their own private little army, and that would entail the Spartans settling local quarrels for the Macedonians. Specifically, Perdiccas wanted to use the Spartan army to defeat some of his enemies to the west. And the other problem was the Macedonians didn't quite understand the concept of freedom of the Greeks, because this did not have the Greek system of city-states. Instead, it was a palace-based culture in which all of the people that lived in Macedonia were subjects. So when Brasidas gets up there and says, hey, we're going to go liberate all these cities from the Athenian Empire, Perdiccas was like, what? I want to make them subjects, not give them freedom. So that was a source of tension. And by the time Brasidas headed to the Chalcidice, which is right here, the Macedonians were already cutting back on the promised supplies and troops. So let's take a look at northern Greece here. So this area right here is a Chalcidice, and this was the area that Brasidas was hoping to destabilize. And then he wanted to head to Amphipolis, and I'll show you a map of that in a minute, and capture Amphipolis. And the hope was that this would cause rebellions throughout Thrace, and they would sort of move east. And then this would threaten the vital grain routes going up the Hellespont all the way up to the Black Sea. And so Brasidas succeeds in destabilizing some parts of the Chalcidice. One such key city was Torone, which is right here on the map. Now, one of the first cities was the city of Acanthus, and Brasidas hoped to use this as his primary base, and so his army arrived there. Now, he didn't immediately attack the city. He actually wanted to convince the city to switch sides away from the Athenian Empire. Now, as we know from the ancient chroniclers, the Spartans were not great speakers. That was just not one of their skill sets. But Brasidas seemed to be the exception to that rule, and he seemed to possess the silver tongue. And so he tries to convince the citizens of Acanthus to switch sides, and he threatened to destroy their vineyards if they refused him. And well, how can the ancient Greeks survive without their wine? Well, it worked, and the Acanthians signed on the dotted line, and now Brasidas had a base out of which he could operate in the Chalcidice. Now in December, he marched to the city of Argolis, who also immediately declared for Sparta, and he did this through a snowstorm, because this was in December. Now, this was a problem for the Athenians because during the winter season, the winds in the Aegean were blowing from north to south. So there was no way the Athenians could send a navy up there to deal with Brasidas until spring of the next year. And so basically all the Athenians up north would be on their own until the spring came around. Now from Argolis, Brasidas traveled to Amphipolis and was able to seize the bridgehead heading up to the town. And he was able to conceal his army through another snowstorm. Now by this time the alarm had been raised in Amphipolis and the gates were secured. The Athenian commander of the garrison at Amphipolis sent word to the overall commander of the area, which just happened to be Thucydides. Yes, the historian himself. He was actually a general before he became a famous historian. But there was one problem here. Thucydides was on the island of Thasos, and it has never really been explained why he was there. So he quickly gathers his forces and heads to Eion, which was a port city at the mouth of the Strymon River. So Thucydides arrived there and was able to secure the port city, and then he hoped to go up and relieve the siege at Amphipolis. But it was too late. Brasidas offered generous terms to the people at Amphipolis. Anyone who wanted to stay could keep all of their possessions and would be left untouched. In addition, anyone that wanted to leave would also be able to take their possessions and would be allowed safe passage. And so the city agreed, and all of the Athenians were forced to flee to Eion. And so this was a huge loss for the Athenians because it controlled the Strymon River, as you can see right here. And it was also the source of vital gold and silver that was used by the Athenian mint. Now, back in Athens, there was outrage at the loss of Amphipolis, and Cleon looked for people to blame. And he found an easy victim in Thucydides, since he had been the overall general in charge. And so Cleon blamed Thucydides for the disasters up north and sent his case to the Athenian court. The Athenian court eventually judged him guilty, and as was the usual practice for all unsuccessful generals, he was exiled. But his actions did save Eion from falling. But that would not be enough in the end. Now, I suppose we owe Cleon and the Athenian court a great debt of gratitude, because that action alone provided us one of the world's great historians. So at this point, the main problem for Athens were all of the rebellions in Thrace and the Chalcidice. And there were problems for Sparta as well. Brasidas couldn't get any reinforcements up north, so he essentially was on his own up there. Now, in the following year, the Spartans and Athenians agreed to a truce in the spring of 423 BC. But there were some immediate problems with the truce. First is the Boeotians outright rejected it. And the Boeotians began to increasingly run their own independent operation. And we will see this going forward, where they listened to Sparta less and less. The other major problem was this town called Scione. Now, Scione had rebelled a couple days after the truce was signed. So technically, the Athenians had every right to go up there and crush that rebellion, since that was not part of the truce. Now, Brasidas tried to play some games here. He tried to make it appear that the rebellion at Scione had actually happened a couple days before the truce was signed. But the Athenians weren't buying into that, and Cleon considered Scione still part of Athenian territory. But what was Brasidas to do? Was he going to go to the people of Scione now and say, I'm sorry, we have to call off the rebellion and you have to go back to the Athenian Empire? That would have made Sparta and Brasidas look like a bunch of fools. And so they allowed the rebellion to continue. Now, by this time, Cleon and much of the Athenian assembly had had enough of the rebellions up north, and so they instituted a harsh policy. If any of the cities were ever returned to the Athenian Empire, the people of those cities would be treated as traitors and arrested, and all men of fighting age would be put to death, and the women and children would be sold into slavery. Now, there were a couple good things that happened for the Athenians in late 423 BC. First, the Macedonians switched sides back to Athens, and so that really cut off the supply routes to Brasidas. Also, Nicias was able to recover Mendi in the north by the end of 423 BC, and that technically didn't violate the terms of the truce.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now that sketch on the right is a drawing from the 19th century of Amphipolis, and that bridge right there would have been the bridge that Brasidas captured. And up farther you can see the town of Amphipolis. Now, remember that truce was a one-year truce, and so by the summer of 422 BC, the truce had expired. And it really had no chance of holding because Sparta would not discipline Brasidas over his actions at Scione, and Cleon was hell-bent on recapturing Amphipolis. Now, the Athenians by this point had a lot of advantages. They had total naval domination up in the area. I think at this point around 100 ships were operating in that region. And of course, the Macedonian and Thracian allies were supporting the Athenians in their cause. And so Cleon heads up north with his task fleet of 30 ships, 1,200 hoplites, and 300 cavalry, along with many other troops from the Athenian allies. And he achieves some success. He recaptures Torone, and then he took up a position at Eion, which you will remember a few slides ago was at the mouth of the Strymon River and very close to Amphipolis. Now by this time, Athens had recaptured most of the cities in the north, and thus Brasidas was forced to retreat to Amphipolis. Now Cleon decided to move his army close to Amphipolis and do some scouting around the city, but Brasidas launched a sneak attack, and Cleon was forced to retreat. But the retreat was poorly arranged, and Brasidas was able to strike boldly against the Athenians, achieving a major victory. Cleon was killed, and the entire Athenian army was forced to flee back to Eion. The casualties on the Athenian side were very high at 600. Only 7 Spartans were killed, but one of them was Brasidas. He died of his injuries, but he lived long enough to learn of his great victory. Now, with the death of Brasidas and Cleon, the two main war hawks on both sides were dead, and this allowed for a real truce to be signed in 422 BC. And 1 year later, the Peace of Nicias was signed in 421 BC, and it was Nicias who was in charge of the negotiations for the Athenians, and thus it goes down in the history books as the Peace of Nicias, and we will get into that in the next video.